You're welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. As the year gradually winds down, we're taking a look at the year in review from a socio-political perspective. The question that readily comes to mind is whether Nigerians fared better in 2019. Did the 2019 elections throw up a better leadership? What about the democratic space and institutions? Was the 9th National Assembly better positioned to deliver the dividend of democracy? Or what about the judiciary? Was there respect for the rule of law? And most importantly, were Nigerians more united or divided in 2019? Well, joining us to discuss this and more is now from our Abuja studio, Dr. Sam Amadi. Dr. Sam Amadi, you're welcome to the show.
Sam, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Kaju.
All right, now, based on, what we just said right now, a few of the questions, how would you rate, let's begin with how Nigerians fared. Were we more divided? Were we more united? Looking at the various issues that we've had, for example, the Revolution Now protest, as we saw from the attack that happened a few days ago with one of the conveners for the peaceful protest, Deji Adeyonju, we saw a clear division right there. Looking at that kind of situation and more, how would you say we fared in terms of our unity for 2019?
Well, obviously, Nigerians are now more divided than they were, let's say, 5 years ago or even last year. So Nigerians are more divided. We can even say that we're witnessing what is now called the tribalization of public discourse, in the sense that in the Twitter war, on Facebook, on visual space, Nigerians have now, kind of created silos for themselves. We're not communicating with one another. And with what happened with Deji, what a way to end the year. We now some people are saying, are we back to the Abacha days of 5 million man march versus 2 million man march and all that. So essentially, the last 1 year has seen a much more divided country. We've seen loss of public reason. Debates around governance are being conducted in a language of warfare, in a language of take no prisoners. So not just that we're divided, but we are losing or we have lost public reason, which is the real cultural, flavor of democracy. Democracy requires citizenship, and the definition of citizens is those who are governed by public reason that is sourced from the law, the constitution, and that sense of common destiny that sustains liberal democracy. So essentially, we are far more divided than we were before the beginning of this year, before the election of the Mr. President, and perhaps we are losing the capacity to create consensus, which is critical for any meaningful socio-political mobilization for transformative governance. So we are more divided, obviously.
Well, Sam, if you look at the economy, which everybody says is very important, the CBN governor and other commentators have said, well, the CBN on the monetary side has succeeded this year in consolidating on the post-recession phase, and that we've recorded some significant growth in the third quarter and also in the fourth quarter, which we may likely carry onto the first quarter of 2020. How will you rate the economy? Some of the measures that have been adopted on the monetary side and also on the fiscal side. Take, for example, the closure of the border. The president says this has led to reduction in smuggling up to about 30%. The Minister of Information says customs revenue has gone up. Now, how the economy has been managed, what's your assessment? What's your take? Do you think that we have seen some movement to the advantage of the average Nigerian on both the monetary and fiscal sides?
Well, I think on the monetary side, I think I will give CTBN a passing grade. They have been fair. They have been successful in controlling money supply, successful in dealing with issues that surround management of inflation and management of even the foreign exchange. Of course, we don't expect, we've had much more stable, those fundamentals have been stable for a long while. Again, in their interventions, which is also sort of physical interventions around supporting textile, supporting agro-business, the CBN has moved away from, maybe you can say, conventional, the idea that people like Friedman and others peddled around the role of the central bank of the Fed, as the case might be, to basically be focused on monetary policy, forget fiscal policy. But this CBN has been good in shoring up support for indigenous manufacturing, which is good in my view in terms of helping to simulate growth in a sustainable manner. The policies around the border closure, mixed grill, I think we can say clearly that it has benefited some local manufacture in terms of, for example, the chicken farmers, they're talking about, they're going to the bank this Christmas. So rice, local rice production in some cases benefited, even though there are issues around the borders in the north, which has remained porous, and allegations of smuggling of foreign rice through those borders. But essentially, I think those were, in a way, much successful. The impact has been successful, even though someone can complain about impact on low to medium entrepreneurs, but in terms of the big agricultural industrialists, there has been a good policy. But essentially, if you look at household income, if you look at the report from the National Bureau of Statistics in terms of general price increase, if you look at in terms of real income, if you look in terms of even the haggling around minimum wage and the lack of implementation up to now, even though the federal government seems to have signed it off, all that meant that the average household still feels kind of let down. So we can say that generally the economy has been performed poorly. It's this year that we became the largest concentration of poor people, extremely poor people in the globe, reaching about 94-point-something million of the estimated 200 million or 190 million Nigerians being acutely poor. And then the statistics shows that, if you look at the poverty clock, you see movements in and out. In Nigeria, movement into poverty at every second or minute, you see about 4 or 5 people rushing to becoming extremely poor. Whereas even countries as poor as Ethiopia, the movement shows exit. So Nigeria is one of the few countries in the world where we expect that poverty will increase rather than decrease based on simulations from what we have today. So essentially, in the economic terms, in terms of the expansion of the economy, we've done very badly. The economy has not expanded. We've seen we have been able to be maybe more conservative in terms of these resources, but we have also increased our debt profile to a very astronomical level, far more than aggregate of many, many years in the past. So essentially, in all these scorecards, this is not good for the economy. The economy has not done well. It has not done well in household income. It has not done well in expansion of production capacity. The Minister of Finance herself, truthful, says, look, we have more of a productivity crisis rather than a debt crisis. In a way, saying that even though we are borrowing more than we have done before, but essentially we are suffering more from constriction. We have from shrinking in productivity capacity. We're not producing a lot, and therefore our GDP is per capita GDP is still low and very, very low. So essentially, this is, and then the economic policy making has been very low level and routine, if you like. For example, we welcome with fanfare the constitution of the Economic Advisory Council, but so far we've not seen, maybe they are still crunching local data, but essentially we've not seen any heavy lifting in terms of economic policy making. So basically I would score the government this year very, very low, failing grade, very low, very, very low grade in terms of performance in both economic policy making and outcome in terms of both in terms of expansion of growth in the sector and of course household welfare, which has been terrible, this year.
All right. Now, I would like to talk about the National Assembly. Looking at its contributions in 2019, some of the bills put forward, such as the hate speech bill, amongst others, its policies. How would you say, looking at what we were able to put together in 2019, it either contributed or further, made it easier to disrespect the rule of law? Because we've seen a lot of disrespect for the rule of law, in the past few weeks, looking at recent situations.
I think in this year, Nigeria has dropped in terms of the Freedom House assessment, the democracy index. Nigeria is before now rated as what they call hybrid, which means we're not even, democracy is a category, flawed democracy is a category, but Nigeria occupies the hybrid, very low. Hybrid means we're a mixture of democracy and, of course, authoritarian regime. We saw that more manifest this year. Let's take the National Assembly. The National Assembly, of course, had a smoother, election, emergence of principal officers, with the presidency, successfully pulling its weight. But what we've got, of course, Ms. Grill, in terms of helping the government get through their important legislations, the finance reform laws, the very early passage of the budget, that's commendable. So essentially, the National Assembly is now a legislature that will support economic program of the executive. That's good. What we call interdependency and co-management of the economy, and that's how the constitution wants it to be. But in terms of being a watchdog, in terms of oversight, in terms of kind of helping the executive create more rigor in their policies, the National Assembly is failing, and that's really where the problem is. For example, the Senate President announced even before sitting that they're going to pass every president's legislation or request will be passed. That gives a bad optics. That creates a sense of fait accompli. And whereas I'm in support, I'm against an obstructionist National Assembly because we want to be a developmental state, but I'm in support of a rigorous, independent National Assembly, what we call the third way. Under Kennaman, we define it as a third way. The first way is the way of obstruction, the way of fighting. The second way is the way of subservience, but the third way is the way of co-management and interdependence. So we want to see a stronger, independent National Assembly. The idea that if you're not fighting the president, then you have to, kind of be a doormat is gone. It doesn't make sense. You can be friendly, you can be respectful to the executive, supportive, but at the same time, play an independent role as a level of government that's interdependent and equal. The design of the Constitution that isolates the executive power from the legislative power is to ensure freedom and ensure that government there's a balance, a check on error from the executive or even hubris from an undemocratic or authoritarian executive. So we can't rest our democracy on the good sense of Mr. President. We have to rest it on the integrity and the functionality of institutions. And so that's why the National Assembly has got a failing grade this year. Again, if you look at the issues around rule of law, I'm sure when the next democracy index report is issued, Nigeria will further go down on rule of law. We look at democracy from elections. Our elections were terrible. We look at democracy from rule of law. We look at it from freedom, political and economic freedom. In terms of freedom, we've seen maybe strategic and continued shrinking of the civic space. The social media bill, in spite of the need for any form of regulation, the manner in which it would produce, and the language of justification by those who are behind the bill suggests that they are really worried more about the growing sense of dissent, by the growing, the pulling away of the social media from conventional control. And so this idea, as the First Lady talked about, of control, why can't we control Nigeria where China controls billion people, suggests that they've got their concepts wrong. The concept of social media regulation should be one that puts the burden on platforms to control what goes in, so that once something is wrong, they put it away. It's not the one of criminalizing speech even before it's made. So I think they have scored very low on democracy and rule of law.
Yeah, your point is clear, and we hope that the National Assembly will be more responsive in terms of its oversight responsibility, so that it can shed this current toga or perception that it looks more like a rubber stamp assembly. But the biggest event in 2019 in Nigeria was the general election. I would like you to comment on the general election 2019, how we are fared post-election in terms of how the courts have dealt with the election petitions and how the politicians themselves have responded, and whether indeed the political class has learned the relevant lessons from that electoral process, and your projection for the 2023 general election. But we'll take a short break now while you reflect on that, and when we come back, we'd like to take your response. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us in our Abuja studio is Dr. Sam Amadi, former CEO, Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC. And Dr. Amadi, before we went on break, I'd asked you to attempt a review of the general elections in Nigeria in 2019 in terms of the process and the post-election realities with regard to how the politicians behaved and how the judiciary has so far handled over 700 election petitions, and whether Nigerians, the electoral, the political class, and the people generally have learned relevant lessons. And if not, what are those lessons that we still need to learn?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I would like to begin by referring to the former Chinese Prime Minister, Premier's dictum. He says, seek truth through facts. So let's start with the facts. The number of petitions in this arising for the last election is much more than in 2015. In 2015, we didn't have any presidential tribunal case. We had very few cases at all. So that tells you the number of cases that come out of an election is some kind of falsifiable conclusion around the fairness or the freeness. So we have too many cases showing that in many of the operations around the elections, primaries, the re-election, vote counting, announcements, there are several issues around them. Second is, if you look at the violence, In fact, the rerun in Kogi and Bayelsa, particularly Kogi, where a woman was burnt in her house. The level of violence, the deployment of the unprofessional use of security forces. For example, both the PDP and APC chairmen all accuse the military of taking sides. So primarily, those are facts that show how badly the 2019 election were managed. Again, if you look at the issues around INEC's procedures, and even, for example, in Imo State, where INEC had to, be in court against a person declared as winner because the person allegedly threatened, used violence to extract electoral results. So across the country, you see evidence that our elections are not at all competitive. You see, the idea of a competitive election is first that it must be fair. Fair means clear impartiality, level playing field. And so that goes back to the issue around composition of INEC. Many of us have argued for stakeholder INEC, an INEC that is recruited largely from competitive applications, merit-based. The notion of Nigerian politics or African politics of the incumbent appointing referees in election is not one that that makes a lot of sense. So that's where to go. Independence, INEC has not acted independently. INEC has also not shown the capacity. For example, we are asking for rule-making powers. INEC has no power. Why should INEC wait for a legislative amendment for simply decreeing or legislating that elections should be transmitted via electronically? That would have saved us all these issues around counting, recounting, or wouldn't have happened. So the INEC failure to use its rule-making power as a regulator to create a much more transparent process of election front-loads crisis to the judiciary, and the courts are not designed to do retail finding about votes that the judges were not part of it. So I think INEC has failed. Again, if you look at the issues around impunity and accountability, look at the issues around Lagos, the way votes were suppressed, look at the issues around the bullion van, we've seen lack of accountability and the rise of impunity. So anyhow you look at it, the 2019 election was terrible. Look at the primaries, which is the beginning of electoral justice. The Supreme Court had to nullify many of the primaries, and the ruling party had to go without candidates, no competition in some elections, which is not good for the electorates. They are right to choose. They are forced with a fait accompli, the opposition party. So put everything together, we had a shambolic election. I just wonder what Justice Nsofo would have said in 2007 or 3. He said that the Nigerian election was a sham. And now he's an ambassador in America. If he was sitting and look at the whole of this election, would he not call it shambolic? So in my view, the challenge now is going forward is 3 things we must do. First, INEC. We need to think about recomposing INEC in a manner that even the opposition party will have stakeholding, so that the process of managing election will be stakeholder-based. There will be no need for the electoral umpire to be siding one group or the other. Openness. The second issue is around using the power that exists to make elections, voting and transmission of votes electronic. And then finally, I think there's need for us, the politicians now, to realize, and the Nigerian voters, that look, the pathway to development and democracy is through elections. Like experts have argued, if elections continue to look more criminal like they are today, then you are going to attract only leaders who have the capability, the expertise to manage criminal enterprise. And that's why if you look at those who are in power today, you look at we are getting every day the quality of leadership degenerates because the electoral process kind of sorts out the good guys. You know, when elections are terrible, when you create a criminal process in electoral process, then only those who understand the language of crime can really drive through. So we are ending up with a fait accompli. We are a vicious circle. Terrible elections, creating terrible leadership, and those leadership compounding the terribleness of the electoral process because they are experts in managing such criminal setup. So I think we must take electoral reform as the very anchor, the turnkey for development and for democratization. In fact, it's even the turnkey for security because our security challenges are tied up with the loss of legitimacy in governance and with the failing of the state effectiveness. Our states lack effectiveness. It cannot manage the civic space because they are creations of electoral process that based on transaction, based on criminal collusion. And so it's important to kind of tag electoral reform as the most important work both for security and both for good governance and both for development. The poverty capital of the world cannot extricate itself except through sustained good governance, and at the heart of it is electoral justice.
Amazing. Now, let us talk about fundamental rights, Dr. Sam Amadi. Looking at 2019 in general, how would you say the fundamental rights of the Nigerian citizens were upheld, with special focus on, sections 34, sections 35 and 39, talking about freedom of personal liberty, freedom of expression, those situations, rights to dignity of human life and person. How would you say the fundamental rights of the Nigerian citizens were upheld in 2019? Would you say they were respected or they were just simply trampled on?
I think fairly it was not respected at all, and I hold the judiciary responsible. You see, obviously, since 1999, we've had to elect largely, apart from Goodluck Jonathan and Yar'Adua, persons who had military backgrounds. So we can say that the authoritarian logic gets mainstreamed in Nigerian politics. But the judiciary has been civilians, civil persons, lawyers who are trained in the values and norms of freedom and liberty. I'm not impressed with the judicial oversight of judicial review of executive actions. For example, I think the judiciary, maybe because of the blackmail around corruption, kind of find themselves supine in a way to the executive. And so Nigerians lost freedom this year. If you look at the bail conditions that judges were given, I wonder whether it's all in the language of bail. Bail ought to compel appearance in court. And if a judge is not convinced he will be in court, perhaps he will not give you bail. So giving people bail benchmarked to billions of millions of naira and with some very difficult condition, in my view, seems to be that the judiciary is fallen for the blackmail by the executive. Secondly, we saw the Shore case and all the issues around it. I think the judiciary needs to reassert itself and recover the capacity to police its boundary. Liberty, fundamental rights are dead on paper if the institutions of state designed to protect them cannot be triggered easily. We can't forget Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher. She says, look, fundamental rights mean nothing except as a state that has the capacity to protect civic rights. So what we are seeing is the continuing reduction of the civic space and the capacity of institutions to protect citizens. For example, the DSS openly says, look, even if you have complied with judicial process, court conditions for bail, you still have to comply with our administrative guidelines. That really means that, look, the DSS now sits as an appellate court over the normal course of the land. So really, we can't argue the fact that this year we saw a sudden loss of capacity and willingness of the state to protect the fundamental rights of citizens, be the right of protest, right of civil movement, and right of speech.
Sam, we'll need to take another short break, but while we go on that break, I would like you to take time out to reflect on some positive things that may have happened in 2019. Because from national security, national unity, to the economy, to fundamental human rights, to the elections, I mean, you've just been, saying, giving the impression that this has been a difficult year for Nigerians at all levels. But are there some positive things that you can come up with about how we have fared? Or you just have concluded that this was really a very bad year for Nigerians? We'll take a short break now. Well, Sam, maybe before we go on break, you want to start on that subject, and then we'll continue when we return from break.
Yes, sure.
Yes,
okay, I think that some good things have happened. And let me say, for me, the best thing that happened was the fact that in spite of the electoral crisis, the poor elections, terrible elections, the incumbent, the president, the winner, the loser, Atiku Abubakar, everybody submitted to judicial adjudication. At the end of the day, Nigeria did not witness any civil unrest anywhere in the country. We witnessed violence in the election, but after election, we didn't see civic unrest. And I think that's a measure of our democracy, that somehow Nigerians have agreed to restrict their protests, their conflicts within the institutions of law. So that's a big takeaway. In terms of good news, I think the president's response this time around in putting up a team, a cabinet, shorter than before, but although that success was kind of blighted by the quality of person, some of the people we saw on that team, but essentially government started faster than the previous tenure. Again, you can say that the best for the last. The release of Showore and...
okay, we'll take the short break now, but when we come back, beyond politics and business, I'd like you to also maybe reflect on whatever may have happened in sports, in entertainment, and in terms of the individual achievement of Nigerians. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. It's still The Morning Show. Welcome back to The Morning Show here on the Arise News Channel. Still with us is Dr. Sam Amadi, former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC, and he's been helping us in the last 30 minutes or so to review Nigeria in the year 2019. Sam, before we went on break, you were telling us some of the good stories, some of the positives of our experience in 2019 in Nigeria. If you may just continue.
Yeah, like I said first, I spoke about the policy on the border control. I also spoke about the fact that government has been perhaps a lot more, I think the government has been a lot more responsive. For example, if you look at I think the biggest story for me is the portal for transparency. The government has been good in signing up to the OGB, the Open Government program. The government has been good, better than before, in being more transparent and disclosing information. But that initiative by the Minister of Finance is the biggest instrument for fighting corruption. So going forward, anybody can check up any of the expenses above 5 million on the web-based, on the web portal, which is the idea of good governance. It's not about prosecuting people. So that initiative is a big win for this government. It shows a commitment to transparency and a commitment to institutional integrity, which is the driver of good governance and corruption. I think government has done very well at that level. I commend the Minister of Finance actually has been much more democratic, much more open and more honest than in the previous year. So I think going forward, we want to see government manage public policy in a much more transparent way that they're doing now. We can also say, like I said before, that we've seen also a greater sense in which Nigerians commit to fighting their cause through legitimate ways. So even the bill at the National Assembly, nobody's in the street fighting or killing. People are going there, people are the social media, canvassing argument. Democracy is like a messy barbecue. It has to be, you have to work on it. It's not, it's not like a silver bullet. It's something that we have to mess up, put together within a defining framework. And I think the government is probably learning. The release of Showore and Dasuki, although much belated, self-inflicted injury, but essentially can presage a new beginning, a sense in which government understands that good governance, openness, does not really weaken state capacity. And I think going forward, the president perhaps might need to diversify his kitchen cabinet to introduce not just optics, but also conception. I think that's a sense in which those are called the governmentality, those who think about government as essentially about force and control, need to benefit from those who think about government as persuasion and seduction, if you like. That's what government is about. A modern government must be seductive in terms of speaking, in terms of winning support, in terms of showcasing what it can do, what it's doing. So I think that government has, towards the end of this year, perhaps, done the right thing by being more responsive. If you look at cultural, Nigeria has done well in terms of culture with the 3 boxing champions, if you like to say, or 2 boxing and 1 wrestling champion, the UFC champion, all being Nigerians essentially, but not Nigerian citizens as it were. But essentially, it was a year of a revival of the Nigerian cultural, character. In the art and literature, Nigerian women and men are doing fantastic overseas. In fact, it can be said that the African or even the global literature wears a Nigerian flag. It's draped in Nigerian color. So Nigeria is doing well culturally. Nigeria is doing well in terms of sports. Nigeria is doing well in terms of our heroes who are out there. Additional got endorsement by ECOWAS for great performance at the African Development Bank, and of course, Okonjo-Iweala is.
Development Bank.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have our people are doing extremely well in terms of projecting excellence, but essentially we just hope that it works up on Nigeria. In terms of war against insecurity, I think we have gained territory, but we are losing in terms of containing, especially the new wave of jihadist insurgents in the Sahel and in some part of West Africa. Nigeria is lost several, fine soldiers, gallant men and women of the armed forces to Boko Haram, and the world seems to be opening new theaters, unfortunately. But essentially, we'll be able to maintain some degree of control. Especially, Abuja has not suffered any terror attacks, so that's a plus for the government. But they need to do more in terms of. Again, I think the morale is low with men of the armed forces, especially. So government might think about rejigging the infrastructure. Perhaps this is a time now to change the men in control. But essentially, it wasn't a terrible year for insecurity. Apart from kidnapper may be the man of the year. We lost Abuja Kaduna, and then we got increase in high-profile kidnapping. Madume's case signals the low in terms of professionalism. But apart from these very, very bad signals, I think essentially the 2019 wasn't a terrible year for insecurity, but wasn't a great year either. So you can look at several areas of infrastructure. I think government has done well in terms of road. I use the road often from here to the east. I've seen improvement, especially towards the end of the year. The Port Harcourt, Aba, Enugu Road, Port Harcourt, Aba, Enugu Road, fantastic job they have done, if you ask me. So I think the government is doing better in road. Electricity, government has done very badly, and perhaps they should think outside the box and probably think about change of guards in the power sector. But a mixed bag, some good, some bad, but essentially we are getting there.
We are getting there. Now, I would also like to ask, still on hopefully some positive note on what we've been able to achieve in 2019, how would you describe our export of talent from Nigeria, especially the narrative we're also painting Nigeria in to international communities? How would you say we have fared from looking at social media, looking at the world of entertainment, looking at the world of sports? How have we been able to, we understand that the entertainment is, it has a subtle way of sending messages to the government. There's a way our musicians are able to, just send very silent but very significant messages to, the government. We also saw Senator Dino Melaye delving into acting in 2019. So I'd like to ask, entertainment and sports, how are we able to push forward the narrative of Nigeria internationally, and how was entertainment and sports also able to liaise with the political space, to bring about positive dividends?
Yeah, I think we've seen the revival of the Fela brand of entertainment, which is what they call social realism, with Femi Falana's son, with several of these acts. But in terms of Burna Boy's major outing in London, I mean, we are selling Nigeria as, of course, Nigeria has always been the cultural center, if you like, even the 60s, the 70s and 80s. So we are continuing that tradition of the narrative of Nigeria as a land of cultural excellence. So we are seeing the fusion of politics and entertainment, and that's good for both democracy and also good for international. But again, don't forget one thing about Africa. You know, the narrative has been that you guys are good in dancing, you guys are good in dressing, but I want to see you guys good in running yourself well. I want to see a country that's strong, a continent that's strong. In 1960, Time magazine lead on Nigeria was like, this is now the African rising. This is the promise. We have failed that promise largely. So I want to see more work done in the university education, in science and technology, in governance, critical, and in economic development. So 2020 should signal for this government a beginning of the restoration or the beginning of Nigeria, so that once the narrative idea will not be great people with jollof rice, with great dance, with great music, great ashwebi, but also great people who are building together the foundations of good governance, the foundations of intellectual excellence, and who are creating an economy that can spread prosperity across Africa. I think that's what the world is waiting for. The emergence of a Nigeria that will signal the rebirth of an African great continent. That's missing. That's missing.
What's your problem with jollof rice?
Exactly.
The Nigerian jollof is a major cultural icon.
Significant.
And we've beaten the Ghanaians and the Senegalese to it.
Exactly. Time and time again. Time and time again.
I want to forward it.
Let me ask you this.
Wow.
Let me ask you this. President Buhari, just about a week ago, said that 2019 has been a very good year for Nigerians, and that his conscience is clear, and that he believes that history will be kind to him, and he has done his best to respect his oath of office. Do you agree with him? Or you think that there are areas he still needs to look at so that history, as he hopes, will be kind to him?
I think, of course, you know that presidents are peddlers in hope, and that's the right thing to do. The president has to show hope and lead us. I think the gloom is too much. We need to really be positive, and so it's right to say a good year for us. We are alive. There's no major conflict in this country. There are no ethnic wars, part of the rising rhetoric of disunity. So he's right on that point. But I would say, and the president is right to say, perhaps he means well. I think the president came to power with a high level of integrity, a profile of a man who has integrity, who loves this country, who has stood by this country. He needs to cash out this potential. He's losing integrity, which is not good, not because of what he has done, but what he has allowed to do. For example, I think in 2020, Mr. President should just understand that optics matter, that, look, essentially he's going to leave a legacy. He will not be there forever, and what he does between now and when he leaves will define how he's understood for the rest of history. And what should he do? First, I think the president must acknowledge his strength and weakness. His weakness is that he doesn't seem to have a diversity of network and friends. So he may not attract the best people in his team. He needs to diversify his kitchen cabinet. Every government is made or marred by the kitchen cabinet all over the world. So who you bring in is important. I think the president needs to diversify. I think that's also the president needs to rely less on military strength. Oftentimes he talks up the military. If he wants to talk about solutions, he talk about, for example, electoral reform. We're going to make sure the military, the security works to ensure there's free and fair election. No, sir. In a democracy, use more about levers of incentive, use structures. So the focus should shift. It's difficult for a former general, a well-decorated general, to move away from seeing governance from the authoritarian logic. The X and the Y in leadership comes into play. But I think he needs to be helped to understand that, look, changes will happen through incentives. So he has to diversify his team. He has to bring in people who will come with the idea that democracy is not dangerous for effective governance. And I think that's where we should move on.
Be able to take on this segment of the morning show this morning. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again.
Absolutely.